guys, it's tomato planting day, and I wanted to share with you 5 factors that I consider when it comes to the day that I actually choose to start getting my tomatoes in the ground. If you're new here though, my name is Jill from The Beginner's Garden. I also host the Beginner's Garden podcast, and 10 years ago I started my journey as a gardener, as a brand new stay-at-home mom wanting to cut my grocery bill by growing my own food. And now I love to share what I've learned with others, especially beginners, and this is what you can find in this channel. So if you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this one. When to plant tomatoes. It's pretty common knowledge, you probably already know, that the time that we plan on planting our tomatoes in the garden is after our last frost has passed. When we start planting, when we're starting our tomato seeds indoors, or when we go get transplants from the garden center, a lot of times we plan that based on our average last frost date, and that is definitely where you want to start. If you don't know when your average last frost date is, that's a quick Google search away. Find that date. But when that date starts coming near, you have some decisions to make on, okay, is my garden ready for the plants to go into the garden, especially when it comes to tomatoes. Because as we know, averages are averages. The actual last day that you get a frost in your area could be a couple of weeks before your average last frost date, a couple of weeks after. So that's about a month span that how do you decide when to actually get the tomatoes in the garden? So the first thing I do is personally, I like to wait until at least my average last frost date has passed. I have been burned too many times in the past. I don't typically plant my tomato plants before that date. I at least wait until that date has passed. But even after that date has passed, I don't always plant right away. I look at my 10-day weather forecast, and what I'm looking for is nighttime temperatures to be consistently in the 50s. Why do I do that? Well, the reason for that is twofold. Number one, I know from experience, learned the hard way, that if the temperatures are still in the 40s in that 10-day forecast, even a 44, 43 degree forecasted low can easily go down to 40 or even below. And if you listen to this podcast episode with meteorologist Ed Buckner, he actually shares that you can get a frost even if your temperatures are between 36 and 40 degrees. So I don't like to risk it. If the forecast shows nighttime temperatures consistently below 50 degrees, I will usually wait. Like I said, part of that is because I don't want to risk a frost, but the other part of it is that tomato plants actually don't like growing when nighttime temperatures are in the 40s. Yes, if there's no frost, they're not going to die, they're going to survive it, but they're also not going to grow very fast, and they just don't like it. So if I can wait until the temperatures at night are in the 50s, they're going to like it a lot better. The third factor I consider when I decide to plant my tomato transplants outdoors is the soil temperature. You may hear more about soil temperature in terms of seeds germinating in your garden, but soil temperature also makes a difference in transplanting. Specifically when it comes to planting tomato transplants into the soil, you want the soil to be warm enough for those roots to be able to expand and thrive and not just sit there kind of pouty and not growing. That's happened to me too many times. So I like to test the soil temperature and see that it is hopefully 60 degrees or above. I can get away with transplanting if it's in the 50s, upper 50s soil temperature, but they really do like it when it's 60 degrees or above. And that's just another factor that I consider when I decide to plant my tomatoes in the garden. The fourth factor I consider is the size of the transplants. As you can see here, these transplants have grown to be very large, and this one in particular, let me just use it as an example. This is obviously outgrowing its pot. These are ready to be in the ground. If I'm getting really close to that time where I can transplant in the garden and I feel confident with the other factors we just talked about, then I will go ahead and plant them. But if I'm still seeing consistent temperatures in the 40s, or for sure if I haven't passed my average last frost date, I will pot them up into a larger container. This plant right here is an example of how I did that. This obviously was first in one of these smaller containers, but this plant, this is the Hungarian heart. It was actually growing quite a bit larger than the other ones were, so I went ahead and potted it up into a bigger container. I did this because I knew I was nowhere close to my average last frost date or the soil temperature or the nighttime temperatures in the 50s, so I potted it up. But if I'm getting kind of close and I know that my plants are starting to outgrow their containers, then a lot of times I will go ahead and make the call to get these plants in the garden. And the number 5 factor that I consider is how many transplants am I planting? Each year I will typically transplant 35, 40, or even more tomatoes in the garden because I use the tomatoes that we get from harvesting to can and preserve almost all of the tomato products that we as a family will consume all year. So I'm growing a lot of tomatoes. The number of tomatoes that I'm growing definitely plays a role in deciding whether I'm going to plant them all out, because if a late frost does come, it is much easier to cover just a few tomato plants if you have one of those cold snaps where the frost is coming in, or a freeze, and you can cover a small amount of tomatoes. But with the amount that I'm growing, I really don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to rush with getting lots of covers and getting them all in place. I've done that a couple of times. It's not something I want to repeat. So because I have so many tomato transplants, I like to wait a little bit longer so that I don't have to worry about covering. But if you're only growing a few, then it's not really a bad idea to go ahead and plant them if you know that you have something that you can cover them with if a late frost comes. For most gardeners, these factors are all you need to know to decide when the best time is to plant your tomato transplants. Wait until your average last frost date has passed. Check on your 10-day forecast and make sure nights are in the 50s. Check that soil temperature and make sure that they're in the upper 50s, or even above 60 is even better. Number 4, consider the size of your transplants. And number 5, consider how many tomato plants you're actually planting out. But one other factor is important, especially if you live somewhere that you get hot in the summer and you get hot really fast. This definitely applies to me, and I didn't know it as a beginning gardener, but tomato plants actually love warm weather, but they don't do great in hot weather. When the temperature gets 90, 95 or above, especially factoring in humidity, a lot of times the tomato blossoms will drop and they will stop producing altogether. So my goal as a southern gardener, I live in Arkansas, is to get my tomatoes in the ground as soon as I can so that I can get as many of them harvested before the heat sets in. If you live in an area where you don't get really hot during the summer, you're not in as much of a hurry as I am to get your plants in the ground. You can easily wait a little bit longer, making sure your nighttime temperatures are stable, as long as your plants are not outgrowing your pot. You don't have to be in as much of a hurry as I am. But for me, knowing that my tomatoes are on the clock, I need to get them in as soon as I can, that's definitely a factor that I, as a southern gardener, have to consider. All right, now that I've shared with you what all went into my decision to plant tomatoes today, I'm gonna bring you out in my garden and just show you a glimpse of our tomato planting day. I've got my family here to help because we've got a lot of tomatoes to go in the ground, and I hope you enjoy. So I had help from my family because I've been having some back struggles and I can't bend or kneel or anything like that. So my kids and my nephew were a huge help to me today. We were able to get almost all the tomatoes planted. We have one bed we have to get ready, but it was a big relief to get it all done today, and hopefully the weather will hold out and this will turn out to be the perfect timing. That's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the tomatoes that are going in our garden and why we chose to plant them today. If you have any additional tips, be sure to post them in the comments below, and best of luck in your tomato growing this season. If you like this video and want to see more coming up, be sure and like and subscribe, and if you're a podcast listener, check out my podcast, The Beginner's Garden Podcast. I'll see you next week.